January 3rd, 2026. 2 a.m. Caracas time. The lights go out across the capital first, not a blackout, an erasure, engineered in seconds by a force that has spent 5 months learning exactly where to cut. Overhead, more than 150 aircraft are already converging from 20 bases across the hemisphere. Below, inside a fortified compound at Fuerte Tiuna, a man who has run a country for 13 years is being told by his own wife that she thinks she hears something outside. He has perhaps 3 minutes before the walls of his own military headquarters stop belonging to him. He runs, not for a weapon, but for a steel door. A safe room, reinforced, the kind of thing built by a man who always assumed this night might come. He doesn't reach it in time. Special operators from the 160th, flying 100 feet off the water in modified Blackhawks, are already on the ground. By 3:29 a.m., Daches he is airborne again, not as a president, but as a prisoner, headed for a ship, then a courtroom, then a cell in Brooklyn. Within hours, the White House will call it a flawless strike, a triumph of American reach. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looks like. Delta Force, a carrier strike group, a rehearsal compound built to scale, the largest U.S. military operation in Latin America in almost 40 years. But that version of the story has a hole in it, because a raid that clean, that fast, that's certain of exactly which door to breach and exactly which room a man would run to, doesn't happen from satellites and drones alone. It happens because someone already knew, someone inside, someone whose name, to this day, has never been made public. This is not a story about a military operation. Militaries execute plans, they don't write them from nothing. This is a story about the plan itself, about the quiet, unglamorous, and still unsolved question of who, inside a government built on loyalty and fear, decided the man at the top was worth betraying, and about how long it actually took, and how many people said no, before someone finally said yes. For 13 years, the story the world told about Venezuela was a story about one man, a former bus driver who inherited a movement, then bent an entire state, its oil, its army, its courts, around keeping himself in power. Sanctions, indictments, a $50 million bounty larger than any ever placed on a sitting head of state. And still, until the first week of January 2026, none of it moved him an inch. That's the version with a single character. It's also the version that makes the ending feel inevitable. American power finally catching up to a man who'd run out of road. It wasn't inevitable. It was built piece by piece, over 18 months, by people whose names will likely never appear in a single headline. A soldier who refused an offer worth a fortune. A pilot who said no when saying yes could have made him rich. A network of assets so protected that even now in congressional testimony, the word used to describe the source closest to Maduro is simply government and nothing else. This isn't the story of a dictator's fall. It's the story of everyone who was asked to help end it, and the ones who finally agreed. To understand why anyone inside Maduro's government might have been willing to talk, you have to understand what the year before the raid actually looked like, because it wasn't one campaign. It was 3, running at the same time, each closing off a different exit. The first was economic. In July 2025, the U.S. Treasury designated the Cartel de los Soles, the network the DOJ alleges Maduro personally led, a specially designated global terrorist organization. A month later, the reward for information leading to his capture doubled from $25 million to $50 million. The State Department's own language was blunt. Maduro had become the first target in the history of the narcotics rewards program with a reward offer exceeding $25 million. That number wasn't just an incentive for Maduro's arrest. It was an incentive for anyone standing near him. The second was military, and it was impossible to ignore. Beginning that September, U.S. forces started striking vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific that Washington identified as drug smuggling boats. By January, U.S. Southern Command's own count stood at 126 dead across at least 36 strikes. In October, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest and largest carrier, into the region. It arrived off Venezuela in mid-November. Around the same time, President Trump publicly confirmed something intelligence agencies almost never confirm on the record, that he had authorized the CIA to conduct covert action inside Venezuela. The third campaign was the quiet one. In August 2025, a small CIA team entered Venezuela itself, not through an embassy, because by then there wasn't a functioning one to use as cover, but as what the agency calls a denied area insertion. Their job wasn't to strike anything, it was to watch. To learn, as Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane would later put it at a Mar-a-Lago briefing. How he moved, where he lived, where he traveled, what he ate, what he wore, what were his pets. Elite units back in the U.S. began rehearsing against a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound, the same method, briefers noted, used to prepare for the 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden. By the time the last week of November arrived and Trump picked up the phone to give Maduro what would be his final warning, 3 separate machines, money, force, and patience, had already been running for months, closing in from 3 directions at once. Maduro, according to Trump's own account, came close to accepting the offer to leave. He didn't take it, and so the machine that had been built to make someone talk kept running quietly for a few more weeks. Long before the raid, before the carrier, before the $50 million figure existed at all, there was a man trying to do this the old-fashioned way. One relationship, one conversation at a time. His name was Edwin Lopez, a Homeland Security Investigations agent and former Army Ranger, working out of the U.S. Embassy in the Dominican Republic. In April 2024, under a different administration, he began building contact with a man who could have ended the entire standoff without a single shot fired, General Bitner Villegas, Maduro's personal pilot. It's hard to overstate what that access meant. A pilot doesn't just fly the plane. He knows the routes, the routines, the moments when a president is most exposed, sealed in a metal tube 30,000 feet up with nowhere to run. If Villegas agreed to divert that aircraft into international airspace or simply radio the wrong coordinates at the right moment, the story of Maduro's capture could have ended 18 months earlier, with no dead Cuban officers, no firefight, no headlines about a raid at all. Lopez worked him for 16 months. He offered wealth, he offered protection, relocation, a new life for Villegas and his family. At one point, he invoked the reward directly, telling him, "I'm still waiting for your answer," and pushing him with a line that reads almost like a dare, "Be Venezuela's hero." Villegas never said yes. We don't know, from the public record, exactly why. Fear, most likely, of what happens to the families left behind when a man like that disappears. Loyalty, maybe, or simply the calculation that betrayal carries a longer sentence than obedience, even under a regime everyone privately knew was failing. What we do know is that the file on Villegas closed without a signature, and Lopez moved on, and the search for someone who would say yes continued. It's tempting to treat a story like this as a footnote, the attempt that didn't work, cut for time, but it isn't a footnote. It's the shape of the entire effort in miniature. This wasn't one lucky break. It was a long series of people being asked the same question quietly in different rooms for years, and almost all of them saying no. Somewhere in that long list of refusals, eventually, there was an exception. Villegas wasn't the first person Washington had asked to switch sides, and understanding why the U.S. kept asking, why it believed correctly that eventually someone would say yes, means looking at the ones who came before him. Start with Hugo Carvajal. For years, he was one of the most feared men in Venezuela, the head of military intelligence, a man with the power to make people disappear. In 2020, facing his own American indictment, he began quietly discussing surrender. It took years to fully play out, but by the time of Maduro's capture, Carvajal had pleaded guilty in a U.S. court and become a cooperating witness. The same intelligence architecture he once ran, now working against the government he'd served. Then there was Cleaver Alcala, a retired general who walked into DEA custody that same year, 2020, on his own terms, rather than wait to be taken. And then Alex Saab, a businessman close enough to Maduro's government to matter, who by 2018 was already functioning as a confidential DEA source, feeding information to the same agency that would one day help book Maduro into a federal detention center. None of these men were captured in a raid. Each of them, in his own way, walked toward the door himself, sanctions closing in, indictments piling up, the maximum sentence for staying loyal quietly becoming worse than the maximum sentence for cooperating. By the time the CIA began building its network inside Venezuela in 2025, it wasn't starting from zero. It was drawing on a decade-long pattern. Officials watching their own colleagues flip, one at a time, and doing the math on how much longer loyalty was actually worth. Two military analysts writing about the operation afterward put it plainly. The United States hadn't just struck Venezuela's government from outside. It had spent years recruiting from within it, exploiting fractures inside the military and intelligence services that had been widening long before a single helicopter left the deck of a carrier. Carvajal, Alcalá, Saab. 3 names, 3 separate decisions, made years apart for reasons that were never really about ideology. They were about which version of the future looked more survivable. Somewhere on that same spectrum, closer to Maduro than any of them had ever been, was the person who would matter most. And unlike the others, we still don't know their name. By late 2025, the CIA's presence inside Venezuela had grown from a small denied area team into something more precise. A source, singular, positioned close enough to Maduro to matter in a way no defector ever had before. Multiple outlets, reporting independently, converged on the same core fact. CNN described a CIA source operating within the Venezuelan government who assisted the United States with tracking Maduro's location and movements ahead of his capture. Reuters, citing 2 separate sources, said the agency had an asset close to Maduro who would monitor his movements and was poised to pinpoint his exact location as the operation unfolded. The New York Times added a detail almost stranger than the source's existence. It is not clear how the CIA recruited the Venezuelan source. Even the people reporting the story couldn't fully explain how it had happened. The BBC's security correspondent, summarizing what officials would and wouldn't say, put the mystery into words better than anyone. U.S. officials have said they had one particular source who was able to provide detailed intelligence on Maduro's whereabouts. It quickly emerged it was a government source who must have been particularly close to Maduro. That has led to intense speculation about who it was and what has happened to them. But their identity is still not public. Read that again. Not was not yet public. Is not public. Reported months after the raid, after a presidential arraignment, after a Pentagon briefing where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs discussed the operation's outer mechanics in detail, the aircraft count, the rehearsal compound, the exact minute the strike force cleared Venezuelan airspace. All of that the government was willing to say. One thing it has never said is who, inside Maduro's government, decided he was worth betraying. We can rule some things out. This wasn't Delcy Rodriguez or Jorge Rodriguez. Reporting on their contact with Washington describes a separate track entirely. Aftermath assurances passed through Qatar about what would happen after Maduro was gone, not intelligence on where he was beforehand, and Caracas has denied that account outright. It wasn't Diosdado Cabello either. His conversations with U.S. officials, confirmed separately by Reuters, were about stability and restraint, not location. Those are real threads. They are not this thread. What's left is a person we can describe only by function, close enough to know Maduro's habits, down to what he ate and where he slept, trusted enough to move freely near him without suspicion, and disciplined enough that 18 months of increasingly public reporting on this operation has produced not one leak of a name. In a story built almost entirely out of things that eventually became public, indictments, court dates, Pentagon slideshows, that single sustained silence is the loudest detail in the entire file. Everything built over 18 months came down to a window of roughly 2.5 hours, and it began the way these things almost never do in the movies, not with an explosion, but with silence. Trump gave the final order at 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, January 2nd, early hours of Saturday in Caracas. More than 150 aircraft, launched from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere, converged on Venezuelan airspace. Around 2 a.m. local time, U.S. forces struck air defense sites across the north of the country in a tight, coordinated first wave, not to level them, but to blind them, just long enough. Power across Caracas went dark at almost the same moment. Hegseth would later describe it without much elaboration. Largely turned off due to an expertise that we have. Then came the part that had been rehearsed for months against a full-scale replica compound. Delta Force operators, flown in by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, The Night Stalkers, in modified MH-60 and MH-47 helicopters, coming in at 100 feet over the water to avoid radar. Roughly 200 Americans, by Hegseth's later count, moving on a single target, the fortified residence inside the Fuerte Tiuna military complex. Inside, Maduro had almost no warning. Hegseth later described it in blunt, almost domestic terms. His wife, hearing the aircraft outside, maybe 3 minutes before the compound's outer defenses gave way. 3 minutes, after 18 months of preparation on the other side. The first breach wasn't the end of it. It was the start of the part nobody could fully script in advance, because inside that residence was a steel-reinforced safe room, and a man who had clearly always known this night might come. Maduro ran for the safe room. He didn't make it. Delta operators reached him before the door sealed, catching him and Celia Flores before either could disappear behind steel built for exactly this scenario. There was no gunfight at the point of capture itself. By the accounts later given at the Pentagon, both surrendered on the spot. But the compound around them was not undefended. A firefight broke out almost immediately after. Maduro's security detail, along with a Cuban contingent stationed to protect him, engaging the assault force as it moved to extract him. One American helicopter took fire and kept flying. Several U.S. troops were wounded. None were killed. On the other side, the toll was severe. Cuba's state newspaper Grama later confirmed 32 of its own officers, colonels, majors, captains, some in their 20s, some in their 60s, died defending a foreign president in a foreign country. Venezuelan reporting separately put losses among Maduro's own troops at roughly 24 more. By 3:29 a.m. Eastern Time, General Kane would say at the Mar-a-Lago briefing days later, the force was over the water, with indicted persons on board. 2.5 hours, start to finish, for an operation 18 months in the making. Maduro and Flores were transferred first to the USS Iwo Jima, then flown to Stewart Airport in New York, then driven by motorcade into Manhattan, and finally to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, arriving by the timestamp later confirmed to reporters at 8:52 p.m. that same day. The man who had run Venezuela for 13 years spent the day of his capture traveling, blindfolded for part of it, hearing protected, from a fortified compound in Caracas to a federal holding cell in New York, a trip that took less time than most transatlantic flights. What none of the briefings, indictments, or after-action summaries would ever explain was the one fact underneath all the others: how the operators knew, with that kind of precision, exactly which room to hit and how many minutes they had before he could disappear into it. That answer wasn't written down anywhere the public could read. Every story like this eventually produces one artifact that isn't a quote or a briefing, something with dates, dollar figures, and a signature on it that proves the secrecy wasn't just implied. For this one, that document is a federal indictment, and the man named in it never fired a shot. On April 23, 2026, the Department of Justice unsealed charges in the Southern District of New York against Master Sergeant Gannon Ken Van Dyke, a Special Forces soldier stationed at Fort Bragg. The indictment lays out, in the flat language federal prosecutors use, exactly how classified the planning for Maduro's capture really was, and exactly how badly one man wanted to profit from knowing about it early. On December 8, 2025, according to the filing, Van Dyke received a formal classified briefing and signed a non-disclosure agreement, the standard promise never to divulge, publish, or reveal any classified or sensitive information. He had, by that point, been read into the planning for what the operation's own commanders were calling Operation Absolute Resolve. 18 days later, on December 26th, he opened an account on Polymarket, the prediction betting platform, and began placing money on outcomes only someone with real access would have confidently bet on: U.S. forces in Venezuela by January 31st. Maduro out by January 31st. 13 separate wagers, roughly $33,000 total, all landing on the same side of history before that history had technically happened. When the raid succeeded on January 3rd, those contracts resolved in his favor. His profit, per the indictment, approximately $409,681, a return north of 1,200%, earned not from insight into markets, but from insight into a country's president being taken from his own military headquarters. He didn't stop there. He moved most of the money into a foreign cryptocurrency vault, then asked Polymarket to delete his account entirely, falsely claiming he'd lost access to his own email. Investigators later found a photo in that same account. Van Dyke on the deck of a ship at sunrise, in fatigues, carrying a rifle, standing with 3 other men who, the timing suggests, may have been part of the operation itself. Van Dyke's case doesn't tell us who the source inside Maduro's government was. It was never meant to. But it does something almost as valuable to the record. It proves, independently and on paper, that this operation had been locked down at the classified level for weeks before it happened, tight enough that the only leak anyone has ever been caught making wasn't about a name or a location. It was a soldier trying to turn secrecy itself into a paycheck. The identity of the person who actually made the operation possible remains exactly where it started, unwritten. The people who touched this story before, during, and after the raid all landed somewhere different, and almost none of them landed where anyone would have predicted 18 months earlier. Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, was sworn in as interim president on January 5th, 2 days after the raid, in a ceremony administered by her own brother, National Assembly President Jorge Rodriguez. Within weeks, her government opened Venezuela's oil sector to American companies, lowering royalties, releasing hundreds of detainees. By spring, Secretary of State Marco Rubio would say more than 10 million barrels of Venezuelan crude had reached the U.S. under the new arrangement. Trump publicly warned her, more than once, that she could share Maduro's fate if she failed to deliver, an unusually blunt thing to say to a head of state you're also negotiating with. Diosdado Cabello, the hardline interior minister and Rodriguez's chief rival within the old regime, stayed exactly where he was. Named in the same indictment as Maduro, never taken in the raid, still in his post, still meeting quietly with American officials about restraint and stability, even as Washington viewed him as a permanent risk of undoing everything the operation had bought. Maduro himself pleaded not guilty at his arraignment on January 5th, calling himself innocent, kidnapped, and, even from a federal courtroom in Manhattan, still president of my country. In March, a judge declined to dismiss the case. By July, a trial date had been set for June 2027, more than a year and a half after the raid that ended his presidency, with his lead attorney signaling a defense built on head of state immunity. Gannon Van Dyke, released on bond, awaits his own trial. A footnote to the operation, who will likely spend more courtroom hours defending his Polymarket account than most of the people who actually planned the raid will ever spend discussing it publicly. And the source, the one person whose decision arguably mattered more than anyone else's in this entire account, has no listed fate at all. No relocation confirmed, no asylum confirmed, no reward claimed. The $50 million bounty explicitly excludes government officials from collecting it, and in any case, no one has come forward. Rubio, asked about the money after the capture, said only, "I guess we're saving $50 million now." Trump added, "Don't let anybody claim it. Nobody deserves it but us." 18 months of pressure, 3 failed attempts, a decade of prior defections, and one operation executed with the precision of a plan someone had actually seen from the inside. And the person at the center of all of it remains, by design, a name that was never supposed to be written down. Go back to that safe room door, the one Maduro almost reached. 3 minutes. That's the number that sits underneath this entire story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because 3 minutes is not the outcome of a lucky guess. It's the outcome of someone knowing in advance roughly how long he'd take to run from his bedroom to that door, knowing it well enough that a strike force flying in the dark, 100 feet over open water, could time an assault down to the width of that window and land inside it. That kind of precision doesn't come from a satellite. It comes from a person. Someone who watched Maduro long enough to know his habits the way only someone inside a household, an office, or a security detail ever could, and who decided, at some point no one has ever been able to date, that the man they were watching wasn't worth protecting anymore. We know almost everything else about January 3rd. We know the aircraft count, the helicopter type, the exact minute the extraction force cleared Venezuelan airspace, the casualty figures on both sides, down to the ages of the Cuban officers who died defending a house that wasn't in their own country. We know a soldier at Fort Bragg turned classified knowledge of the operation into $409,881 and got caught doing it. We know a pilot said no in 2024, and a general said no before him, and a businessman and an intelligence chief eventually said yes years before any of this began, laying the groundwork without knowing it. What we don't know, and what, 18 months and one unsealed indictment later, nobody in a position to say has said, is the one name that would make all the other facts make sense. Maybe that silence is deliberate protection, the kind every intelligence service owes a source who handed over a head of state. Maybe it's something closer to shame, on someone's part, that the ending of a 13-year presidency came down not to tanks or diplomacy, but to a single person deciding quietly, in a country where that decision could still get you or your family killed, that enough was enough. Either way, somewhere, possibly still in Venezuela, possibly somewhere else entirely, under a name that isn't the one they were born with, is the person who made a 2.5-hour operation possible. They will likely never give an interview. They may never be thanked publicly at all. And the country they helped hand over to history will go on knowing everything about the men who carried out the raid and nothing about the one person who told them exactly where to look.